Sometimes they are forged in politics, in the experience of oppression, right? You have been oppressed because of who you are, because you were a member of a particular religion, a particular gender, a particular caste, right? You have no option, in a sense, but to inhabit that identity simply because that identity is being imposed on you, right? Okay. So identities are often formed in political experiences of oppression. But most of our identities, right, are sustained by acts of imagination, right? Why did you get the vicarious thrill you did when India won the test match, right? When that kind of last four, Rishabh Pant hits the last four, and it's almost like we've hit the shot, right? Yeah. I mean, it's a very quotidian experience in almost any form, right? Whether you go to the theater, whether you identify with your sports team, it's this alchemy by which you produce a vicarious identification with somebody who's literally not you. I mean, it is Rishabh Pant's shot. By the law of physics, the ball hit his bat, not yours, right? But, you get goose pimples. Right? What is it that produces this identification, right? Through the acts of imagination, we manage to identify with dead people, right? Some long lost figure in history, right? I don't know, Shivaji, Akbar, whoever, take your pick, right? We worry about, their future, as it were, right? The person I did my PhD dissertation on, Adam Smith, not just an economist, wrote a brilliant book called The Theory of Moral Sentiments. And Smith always used to puzzle. He said, people actually don't act out on interest. What is this alchemy of the imagination by which we even feel bad for dead people, right? Don't sully their reputation. So the imagination is actually, or the act of imagination is the form in which our identities are expanded. Right? And it is through the freedom to imagine that I also have the freedom to identify. This identification with larger collectivities is very thrilling, right? I feel part of a larger story, right? I'm vicariously elevated, right? For that brief moment, right? I felt ecstatic, right? In ways in which if I had purely reasoned about it, I would not, right? If I were thinking about the truth or knowledge, I would not, right? So the imagination has this peculiar capacity to make us step outside of ourselves. That's its biggest power. And that's the power that is at the base of all identity, particularly all collective identities. You've imagined them. It's not a question of, are they true or are they false? Frankly, that question is actually kind of irrelevant when you're thinking of the faculty of imagination, right? Is it true? Is it right that you should take a vicarious thrill in Rishabh Pant's favor? You might say, what kind of a question is that, right? Yeah. So the imagination is what is at the base of the construction of our identities. But this very act of imagination that expands our horizons, right? You actually, in a legal sense, most of you might be IITians or members of whichever college you are, right? But there is an imaginative empathy and act of identification that gives you a certain kind of group solidarity, right? But here is the risk and the danger of this, which is, on the one hand, the imagination elevates you and makes you part of something larger. But in the very act of making you part of something larger, it also makes you something particular. right? In my act of identification with the Indian team, I literally not just perform, right? But in a sense, I become quote unquote an Indian. I'm being named as one thing rather than another. This act of imagination also involves a kind of self-surrender, right? In fact, one of the reasons identities are so fascinating is because they invariably mean a surrender of your individuality, right? You're now being identified through a particular act of categorization. I'm Hindu, I'm Muslim, I'm Jain, I'm Sikh, I'm Dalit, whatever that might be. Okay? Right? Now, this very feature of the imagination, right, which makes both a kind of abstraction and self-surrender possible, also makes identity a threat, right? And the paradox is this: our imagination liberates us from our own limited self. I mean, I as an individual am quite boring, right? I am as an individual quite limited. My horizons are limited. This act of imagination gives me the thrill of identifying with a community, some larger entity whose history I care about, right? Gives me all the vicarious thrills and pleasures and the tragedies of that history, right? You just feel more intensely. But that very act of enlarging myself also becomes a fetter for me, because I sort of alienate myself, I surrender myself to this identity, right? It's almost like we escape the prison of our individual identity only to be dumped into this larger kind of collective narcissism, right? And so the question for us, I think, is going to be, when you think of freedom and identity, right? Identities, of course, matter to people. I mean, I'm not going to deny that. And they matter to people for all kinds of reasons. Okay? But is there a way of imagining the importance of identity, that identity does not become a kind of fetter and a prison for you? Why am I one thing rather than another? Right? It's important to any act of creation of identity that it be an act of self-identification, right? That identity not be, in a sense, imposed on you in any way, shape, or form. And I think India's big tragedy is that most of the identities that we inhabit in our political discourse are almost kind of compulsory identities. Even if you denied being part of those groups, right, you would still be categorized in those groups just by legal classification. That's the simplest form of, in a sense, imposing a compulsory identity in some way. But even apart from legal classification, more subtly, the minute you name your identity, right? If I say I'm a Jain, if I say, I'm a Dalit, whatever, just what are the scripts that are meant to be associated with that identity, right? Do you actually control those scripts? I mean, I think that great sort of, insight from sort of, our medieval bhakti poets, from Bulle Shah to Kabir, right? When Bulle Shah says, Bulla ki jana main kaun, right? There's actually the deepest philosophical point there, which is the very act of naming me will constrict me. The minute I say my name, right, you will have a ready script associated. Maybe my Wikipedia page is my script, right? Okay. So this is, in a sense, the paradox of freedom and identity. We want the freedom. We should have the freedom to imagine our identities as we wish. Why should anybody have the right to name us? Right? If they name us, or if we name ourselves, why should anybody have the right to control the script that is associated with that name? What does it mean to be a good Hindu, good Muslim, good Sikh, good Indian? God knows, right? So what I wanted to kind of suggest to you that, these sort of three large, as it were, challenges, right? Can our social arrangements be an outcome of the collective freedoms we exercise? Or do we take those social arrangements as simply given? We just operate within those horizons, right? Are our desires colluding with new regimes of surveilling and crafting the self, right? And is the very thing that we want to imagine when we expand ourselves, right? New identities. What are the ways in which we imagine them that they actually become fetters, and what are the ways in we imagine them that can, in a sense, continuously open us up? I think these are going to be three sort of large philosophical, social, existential challenges that we did a terrible job of answering. In some ways, we've left you pretty conservative horizons. Just don't even think about anything beyond the nation state, right? When you think of democracy, think of democracy in very limited terms. Yeah? So that's, I think, where we are now. More concretely, and this I'll be just very quick about. What will India look like in 5 to 10 years, right? If we use this, in a sense, template of freedom. I think it's fair to say that India's economic performance is most likely to be middling. I think the old joke about the Indian economy still holds. It's never as, at least the last 20 years, it's not as bad as you think. It's never as good as you think it can be, right? We'll probably hit the 6 to 7% growth rate. That's not rocket science. I mean, we just have to avoid catastrophic mistakes. But the nature of our development model, it's very clear coming out of the pandemic that economic inequality will only grow. Right? And just the plain facts, which are kind of sobering, even if you get 7%. The Sensex is at 50,000. But just think of this, right? One of the things the pandemic reminded us, if you look at the CMI survey, that there are at least 40 to 50% of Indian households could not survive a week if they were not paid wages. Right? Just imagine what that means. There's some very good indicators. Fertility rates are dropping. I think on gender indicators, the curve will probably begin to turn, which is extraordinary news for a society like India. But for the first time in the last 20 years, the rate of growth of achievements in nutrition is declining. Right? In fact, the new NFHS data on serious wasting. Yeah. So the basic question is, will India be what economists call like a K-shaped recovery? The top 20, 25% will do spectacularly, as they have done over the last 20, 25 years, right? But will the rate of economic empowerment of the rest of the 60 to 70% be actually what we want? And my worry is that I think most of the things we are doing are literally going to benefit the top 25% more than anything else. There are a couple of exceptions. I think, the Prime Minister's Modi's political model is to provide what my friend Arvind Subramanian calls private public goods, which are important: gas, sanitation, electricity. But these are not being matched by the accompanying investments in public health, education, and the environment that you need. Okay? And those have as much impact on poverty as anything. It's a kind of no-brainer. But this is something we will probably figure out. I mean, we'll make mistakes, we'll figure out. The biggest worry, though, about India is this. And, I'm sure Karunanandi will talk about it with greater depth tomorrow. She's a constitutional scholar. I dabble in writing about the Constitution. And I edited the Oxford Handbook of the Indian Constitution a few years ago with some colleagues, which is one of the standard reference works for the Indian Constitution. And I have to say with a straight face that I cannot walk into a classroom now and tell my students what the Indian Constitution is. That's how radically it's been transformed in the last 4 to 5 years. Just take the 5 or 6 basic elements of that transformation. If you read the preamble of our Constitution, it's a beautiful preamble, very simple. Basically calls for liberty, equality, fraternity. And most importantly, to my mind, it actually says that it is the dignity of each individual, right? India is not a federation of communities. It's a zone of freedom. Every single individual's dignity. If that is honored, a new form of community and fraternity can be created. What our Constitution does not do, very wisely, is burden us, right, with God, identity, or history. Not because, our Constituent Assembly members were deracinated Indians who did not understand the importance of identity or God or history. I mean, God knows they understood these things much better than we do. But because they did not want to burden any of us, right, with an official script on God, identity, and history. By the way, even a communist constitution like China's actually burdens the Chinese with the whole weight of a sort of, civilizational identity. Our Constitution's brilliance, the preamble's brilliance in particular, very spare and pithy brilliance, was to say, it's precisely because these things are so important that they have to be left to individuals to imagine whichever way they want, right? Burdening you with that, there is one way of being Indian, there is, an official religion, whatever. Or even that there's a singular civilization, that is actually not to take them seriously. Okay, so that was the promise of constitutionalism. There is no question that we are now on the pathway of becoming a Hindu majoritarian country. This majoritarianism is being enshrined in law. Nobody objects to giving citizenship status to Hindu and other, refugees from neighboring countries. But for the first time, in a very serious way, we enshrined religious discrimination in the law. The narratives that are being written about this country, right? When Prime Minister Modi acted as high priest consecrating the Ram temple at Ayodhya, no matter whether you think the temple construction is justified or not, let's not even get into that. Maybe there's a case for that. But he told a very simple story. He said the day of the consecration of this temple is going to be as, if not more important than 15th August. Because this consecration is a liberation from 1,000 years of slavery, not just a couple of 100 years of white colonial rule. Think of what that means for a prime minister to say that, right? It was a narrative that, that diametrically opposite to Nehru's. What was Nehru's narrative? India is a palimpsest on which every civilization has written, in a sense, its history. We are a Christian nation, a Muslim nation, a Sikh nation. Are we a Western Enlightenment power? Are we an Asian power? Its genius is that it's everything. Okay? So the poison that is being instituted in our civil society, I mean, frankly, I think the US should be a warning, but in my lifetime at least, not even in the early days of the Babri Masjid, Ram Janmabhoomi movement, have we seen the open legitimization, right, of majoritarianism. Of course, there are issues. I mean, you could argue previous governments played politics, pseudo-secularism, all of that is the case, right? We can, but those are things that can be settled in a constitutional framework. What you can't do, poison, right, in a bucket and then sort of expect the whole thing to flourish. Just like white supremacy in the United States, and you've seen the consequences. The checks and balances of our constitution, right? Some high courts are passing extraordinary orders defending civil liberties. Allahabad High Court, for instance. I have to say, in all honesty, we might as well not have a Supreme Court at this point. On every single issue that impinges on personal liberty, the Supreme Court has acted as a tool of oppression, either by abdication of its duties, right? Or in a sense, simply not understanding the Constitution. I mean, you can just cite example. You don't have habeas corpus protection in this country anymore. I mean, just think of this Munawwar Farooqi, right? I don't know if you've ever actually watched any of his sketches. I mean, one of the great things about him, actually, he's much more brutal on Jawaharlal Nehru, by the way. Actually, if there is a place where he's, right, he is in jail. So you can ask the question, right, what kind of a constitutionalism is? Those checks and balances have disappeared, more or less, right? And the list is long. We are in unprecedented time where the alliance of state and capital is trying to control our information order in a way that is unprecedented in Indian history. Right? The ownership of television will obviously makes that pretty clear. You might say, okay, isn't social media an antidote, right? But it has turned out to be the case that, in a sense, it is the power of regulation and disinformation that matters more in social media than the power of resistance. So you're in a completely unprecedented information order as far as a democracy is concerned. Dissent. Now, dissent is always problematic for a democracy, to be honest. And I want to use the technical term of dissent, because when we often talk of dissent, we just think of disagreement. Disagreement is not dissent. Dissent is it's almost the opposite of consent, right? Where you kind of almost withdraw your consent to government. With a couple of exceptions apart, the standard characterization of dissent now is that dissent is a conspiracy. It's a Islamist minority, left liberal cabal, anti-national conspiracy. If that is how you construct dissent, no checks and balances can survive. Okay, so I can just go down the list. Federalism, right? Legislation this government has passed has violated, the allocation of powers in our constitution. So my worry is that this imperfect framework that we had of our constitution, right, which is the basis of a new kind of conversation about freedom, that is more or less stands decimated at this moment. Most of us are not feeling it because it doesn't affect us. Let's be very clear, right? 75 to 80% of India's population doesn't feel imminently any of these threats, right? If you're not a minority, you don't feel the threat of majoritarianism, right? Civil liberties, yeah, I mean, so what if, 15, 20 comedians, 20 odd journalists, a few professors, a few human rights lawyers are in jail? Does it really affect us? And so you're not seeing the kind of social movement and backlash that you would expect of a sophisticated liberal democracy. And I think the sobering question for us is this because the poison of hate has seeped much deeper in our democracy? Is this because many people think this is wrong but don't think this is a deal breaker as far as their support for a political regime goes? Yeah. These are, I think, the questions your generation has got to do a better job of answering than we did. But I hope that as you think of the answer to this question, return to that thing I pointed out at the beginning of the talk, which is the power of the imagination. Uh, can you do a better job of harnessing the imagination than we did, where we are so constricted by our own demons and fears that we have let the most precious commodity of freedom slip our grasp? Okay. Thank you so much for being patient, particularly on a Friday night, and wish you all the best.
Thank you, sir, for your speech. Um, Sir, would you be taking questions?
If you want to, sure. I mean, I'm open to if.
Okay, so whoever wants to ask a question, you have two ways of doing that. Either you can DM me or you can raise your hand and we'll unmute you and we'll let you ask the question. So, sir, Ronak had a question. He asked, does the individuality of one's existence stand in way of a collective association? And can the two of them exist in isolation with each other?
Okay, okay, very very good question. So, I mean, this would take a kind of whole seminar. I mean, this is the core question of any kind of social. Um, I think the important thing, right, is uh, one, of course, the distinction between individuality and individualism, right? Individuality does not mean uh, individualism, that you're egotist or selfish. Individuality simply means you lead your life on your own terms, and you even think of the way in which you contribute to the collectivity, right? In terms that are unique to you, that come from your unique imagination, talents, and powers. Okay? When we think of collectivity, right, there are two different conceptions of collectivity that I think we need to distinguish. And and a simple way of putting it is this: one way in which we define collectivity is through the identification of sameness, right? We are all Indians. It's a shorthand way of signifying a collectivity, and most of us are rightly proud members of this collectivity. We wish this collectivity well. We would work hard for this, lay down our lives for it, all of those things, right? But what is it that makes it a collectivity? Is it the fact that we identify with that name, some sameness that comes from being Indian, some benchmark that makes us a member of that collectivity? Or is it something different, which is a form of reciprocity, right? What does reciprocity mean? Where each one of us, right, reciprocally cares for each other's individual dignity and well being. The glue that binds us is not sameness, right? The glue that binds us is not that name, not that script, not that benchmark. The glue that binds us is a form of reciprocity, right? A kind of almost a social contract which says, look, we care about each other qua individuals, right? I mean, what does even caring each other for each other mean, or caring for a collectivity mean, if you're not caring for the individuality of each individual in that collectivity, right? So the governing idea, the glue that binds us here, is reciprocity, not sameness or identification. Okay? And that's the form of collectivity that both protects our individual freedoms, but also creates terms of social cooperation that are spontaneous for us, right? Because we know they're not coming at the expense of our individuality.
Okay, sir, thank you. There was this another question that someone asked, that if you were to pick a starting point or time of the kind of rewriting of history and the subtle and explicit oppression people face today, what would count for that? And was a monolithic cultural dominance like this always in the making?
So is this question about the kind of current or just oppression in general? I mean, unfortunately, history turns out to be a tale of oppression, or is it about the majoritarian moment? Or
So it hasn't been specified, I
okay,
think.
okay. So look, uh, I think Aman is raising it. Did you ask the question, Aman? Okay, different guy. Okay. So I guess let me just offer briefly this reflection. So in more general terms, of course, the sources of human oppression are various. I mean, again, that's something your generation will do a better job of decoding than we did. But I think in the particular case, the particular specific case of majoritarianism, uh, where did we go wrong? I think one simple way of thinking about it is tying it to the answer I gave to the previous question, in thinking about individuality and reciprocity rather than community. So when you look at our national movement, right, there's a tension between two strands in that national movement, and that's a tension that's kind of inherent in our politics now. One strand wants to, in a sense, speak the language of liberty, equality, fraternity. And in the language of liberty, equality, and fraternity, the dignity of the individual, right, is always, in some senses, front and center. But when we often speak of India, we slip into another language, which again sounds very attractive, but has its problems. That's the language of imagining India as a federation. So, when we look at India from 30,000 feet, oh, this is this incredible mosaic of communities, right? Okay? And of course, descriptively, that's true. Of course, we cherish that diversity, right? But diversity is not a free linking it to freedom, because first of all, diversity is compatible with internal oppression, right? A society can be diverse, but none of the individuals within the different communities within it are necessarily free. In fact, diversity can sometimes be maintained precisely by coercing individuals, right? Okay. Now, a lot of the discourse of the national movement in the second realm, then it became a question of India as a federation of communities, and how do we find a balance between communities? How do Hindus and Muslims share power? Right? That was the big question of negotiation before independence. I mean, that's kind of what led to partition, right? Uh, if you don't share enough power, the minority feels threatened. If you share more than the fair share as comes from one person, one vote, the majority feels you've given the minorities an undue veto, right? Now, that very language itself, and that's how even contemporary politics often works, right? The balance between communities. That language is inherently unstable, because once you have posed the question as a question of a permanent majority versus a permanent minority, there's no solution to that problem. And the way in which our politics was then conducted was to, in a sense, try and find this balance between communities. In that balance, a lot of the fundamental questions about freedom remain unresolved. So how did we approach freedom of speech, right? We said, okay, let's ban things that are offensive to all communities equally. So if we ban satanic verses, let's ban Basveshwara, right? It's a perfectly compatible argument with diversity, right? But it's not an argument that's compatible with freedom, right? Um, each of our communities has internal oppressions within them, right? Particularly, gender is almost always the axis around which community identity is invested, right? We needed a very frank discussion about what collective identity actually means for freedom and equality on those dimensions. We kind of postponed those questions, let's say personal law, those kinds of questions, right? So the issue is, and within our constitution as well, do we now say that the things that should bind us are saying the zone of agreement around individual freedom? And if you have freedom, by the way, diversity will be preserved anyway. In fact, it will be a richer diversity because new forms of identities will emerge, right? It's because that second view won out of India as a kind of federation of communities rather than as a kind of zone of individual freedom that we keep going round in circles. How do we balance one community power against another?
Sir, thank you for your answer. Kunal Gupta is raising his hand. I'll request you to please unmute yourself and ask your question.
Hello, am I audible?
Yeah, loud and clear.
Yeah. So, like you mentioned about society imposing identities on individuals, and you said that the focus should be on self-identification rather than societal imposition. But what I was wondering was, in a lot of cases, especially in India, we see that what society imposes is often internalized, and that leads to some coerced self-identification of that particular identity. So, for example, like a woman might be like a cultured or maybe treated in such a way that it becomes for her as a matter of honor to say commit sati in Hindu culture or wear a burqa regularly in Muslim culture and in any other religion. So that is my question. How do we politically differentiate between a coerced self-identification, or do we even need to do that?
No, that's a very powerful question. And obviously, identity discourse happens in lots of different contexts. So one of the implications of what I'm saying isn't that you don't recognize identities at all. So, for example, when identities have been the axis of oppression, you first have to actually recognize that identity was the axis of oppression, right? Caste, for example, right? I mean, this is not a kind of blasé argument that you in a sense can be cast, and you're not recognizing that oppression if you're not recognizing that it's in virtue of caste that oppression took place, right? Okay. So in that sense, you have to recognize identities. You also have to recognize the fact, I think, as you're very powerfully pointing out, that most identities in India actually are imposed and coerced. I mean, there's not, they aren't often expressions of self-definition in some senses, right? Self-definition can often be a privilege in some ways, right? But the point is to, in a sense, make that prospect of self-definition available to everybody. Now, what are the circumstances under which it becomes available? First, a degree of material resources is important. I mean, how can you have the opportunities of self-definition or contest, or let me put it negatively, how can you contest imposed identities, right? If you are consistently made materially dependent on particular structures of power. Okay? So let's not deny the fact that there is a kind of material basis to this power of self-definition. Okay? Number two, when you're recognizing identities for the purposes of justice, right? The claim is that you were excluded because of a certain identity. This identity was both imposed on you And of course, it has, in a sense, been internalized, right? Sometimes with resistance, sometimes in a sense without resistance. But the aim of public policy is to create the conditions where neither is that imposition possible, nor is that internalization necessary, right? That's the kind of important thing. Consistent with the self-definition argument, if you choose to define yourself a particular way, no third party can come. So no, sorry, don't define yourself that way, right? The only thing we are worried from a justice point of view, right, is that the form of your self-definition should not be under circumstances where, as you said, you can plainly see, right, that you have been left with no option, but to, in a sense, to be in a, kind of, defined this way, right? The third is, of course, you need a general background of freedom. How do you know that an identity is yours? If the option, at least, of thinking. Now, look, changing identity is not easy. I mean, I'm not going to say that they're like clothes, you just take off one sweater, put on another, right? They have deep psychological hold on us. There's a profound history attached to them. But even to see the particularity of your identity in a kind of way, at least requires the imagination and the freedom to imagine other things, right? So all of these background conditions of freedom have to be in place. Only then can you say, yes, this identity is a kind of, an act of self-definition. I think Aman has a question.
Yes, sir. Raman has a question. Also, there's another question.
Sure.
Which I would like to ask. So, sir, someone asked that, imaginatively speaking, do you think that we can, tell us a story about ourselves without affecting a categorization into different identities? And if not, then how can we effect a change so that our future is built on different identities?
Okay, good. Okay, this is a very difficult. You're right? I mean, by my own logic, I mean, even the act of naming, right? To have an identity is to limit yourself in some ways, right? I mean, otherwise you're just a kind of clueless, boundless self. Okay, so it is in the inherent nature, in some senses, of identities that they limit us, right? And in order to be able to even function as agents, right? Even if it's an individual identity, you have to limit yourself. Okay? So the problem is not that. The problem is three things. One, the false necessity that you attribute with your identity. Yes, you are this, but you could have been something else. And you can imaginatively at least understand for that reason why somebody who's different from you, who's chosen another path, another identity, right, is also somebody you could have been. Yeah? So what you require is a kind of imaginative act of empathy, in a sense, or a different kind of identification with people who have written their script a different way. Yeah. So that's the first, I think, thing, that when we are limiting ourselves, of course, if you join a religion, if you have a particular history, you take a certain pathway. That's perfectly fine. You limit yourself. You say, look, being an authentic member of this religion means doing A, B, and C, and I'm doing it completely freely. That's in a sense perfectly fine, right? But you could also imagine, at least grant the possibility, right, that somebody else might choose, in a sense, a different pathway. Number one. Number two, it's a question of privileging yourself. So the first is imaginative identification. The second is my collective identity matters more than anything else. And it literally trumps everything else, right? So I'm white, okay? A whole lot of privileges follow from asserting that identity. When a country turns majoritarian, right? So it's absolutely perfectly fine for anybody to say, look, I identify as an Hindu. You can even take pride in it, right? But to not consider the possibility that there might be different ways of imagining what that might mean, right? Or to say, because I'm part of this collectivity is privileged, right? That privilege is what's objectionable about identity, and identity usually comes with that privilege, right? All caste identities, all religions historically have, yes, we can talk about, religions preaching the equality of all religions and stuff, but in their social functions, they've always privileged that particular group, right? Okay. So being mindful of the fact that having that identity does not, in a sense, give you that privilege. The third thing, which is most important in a constitutional democracy, is should the rights and obligations you have, right, and that we have reciprocally as citizens, should they flow from the identity you have? Or are they to a large degree independent of that? So, I mean, obviously, there's simple examples you will all agree with. If you go to a court of law, it should not matter at all who you are. Your identity is just a fact about you, right? Really, it's reduced to a kind of facticity, right? So, in things that govern our common life, right, the rules, collective rules that we live by, constitutional rules, as far as possible, to make those rules independent of the identities that you have. And in part, if you do that, those identities also become less of a source of conflict. Because if those rules are going to be governed by the identity you have, what privileges I can get is a function of whether I'm Hindu or Muslim or Sikh. You can see the stake in identity also becomes much greater. The political stake, right? So you have to, in a sense, think of these three things: empathy, imaginative empathy for alternative paths, a sense of equality, and a kind of political discourse that makes identity a fact that liberates you to, think of politics in a different way rather than, consigns you.
Okay, sir. Thank you for the answer. One last question, and the question is that you mentioned that majoritarianism in the country is on a rise. So, don't you think that the state machinery taking over Hindu temples, which is sadly in accordance with the constitution, and the appropriation of taxpayers' money for minorities causes some kind of a contradiction? And what do you think are the major indicators of the rise of majoritarianism in the country?
Okay. This is a very long question. I won't detain you all. I'll try and give a quick answer. Look, so, let's face the fact that our history is extremely complicated. And I can see what the question is gesturing at, because the Indian state has got entangled with religion, whether we like it or not, right? Many people object to the fact that, the state, for example, takes over temples, right? And it's true that in a certain interpretation of the separation of church and state, state running temples is a kind of extraordinary arrangement. For those of you who are not familiar with this, just look up the temple endowments department of any South Indian state. apendowments.org. I mean, the state runs kind of thousands of temples, right? Similarly, it's provided various kinds of subsidies for religious events, minorities, majorities. Now, I think you have to think about two things when thinking about these questions. One is you have to, in a sense, carefully go into the history and the logic and justification of each particular case. So, with the state takeover of temples, for example, which my own personal view is the state shouldn't run temples. But there was a very practical problem, right, which arises in the case of many, temples. In India, particularly if you, let's say, there's the recent controversy over, let's say, the Padmanabswami Temple, for example, right? Many of the temples were historically governed by particular communities, right? Nayars, Nambudris, lots of communities. Or they were often, in a sense, governed by erstwhile princely states. Okay? Now, those communities were often exclusive, right, in the way they governed the temples. Or when the princely states disappeared, as we had this interesting legal case in the Padmanabswami Temple, which is, the Prince of Travancore is supposed to be the high priest of the temple. But if there's no monarchy left, right, who is in a sense the high priest of the temple, right? Okay. Now, who governs these temples? Now, there is an issue with the amorphous character of Hinduism, right? If you ask the question, whose temple is it? You might say it's the temple of all of Hindus, right? In principle, you might say, ideally, temples should be might be even open to others. You'd say all of Hindus. But what is the organizational form in which all of Hindus can control these temples, right? As it turned out, because we were a democracy, right, there was a sense that actually the best way in which the Hindu community exercises control over its temples is through the agency of the state. It's actually not so much the state controlling temples. It's the Hindus using the agency of the state to solve this particular conundrum. Okay? So let's say tomorrow I were to say, let's free the Padmanabswami Temple, or let's free, Tirupati or Chidambaram Temple from this current very weird arrangement that we have, that the state looks after some aspects, right? Who do we give the temple to govern, right? Should all of Hindus across, or should we go back to caste governance of temples? So I do think you need to extricate the temples from state governance and set boundaries on it. But you have to recognize that there was a very particular kind of problem that we faced. And you need a better and more imaginative institutional answer for that, right? Similarly, I don't know whether most of you know, we used to communalize this principle of Hajj subsidies, for example, right? Which many would argue were also anti-Islamic. But historically, there was a reason for it, which is that the shipping routes were closed, right? Because people used to do Hajj by sea, right? And this was meant to be a kind of compensation. Now, I'm not for these kinds of sort of subsidies, partly because they just get politicized in some ways, right? But in each of these cases, let's dig deep and say, okay, what's the core principle, right? That in a sense we want to protect here. And what's the best way of proceeding, of protecting that core principle, right? Now, a state regulating the secular aspects of a religion. So if a Kumbh Mela is happening, look, let's face it, the state has to facilitate this, right? Otherwise, you might have a potential catastrophe. But that's not necessarily a violation, because it's in a way like the state does for all kinds of things, economic activity and stuff. Look, this is what citizens want to do. We are, in a sense, facilitating this now. How it funds it and stuff, hopefully it does it with an even-handed. So I think the most important thing is to go at it case by case. But the second thing, and this is the most important, is that, look, there will be differences, and sometimes people can justly feel aggrieved. We think this practice or this protection of the Waqf board is unfair, or this particular subsidy, to a temple might be unfair, whatever, right? But what happens in our politics is that often we are invested in these issues, not because we care about the justice of what's happening, but because we are, in a sense, full of prejudice and hate. I mean, in a sense, it's the identification with our community, right, these issues are pretexts to communalize politics. They're actually not the causes. Because if they're causes, we can sit around the table and discuss this, right? I mean, there's no, right? You don't have to say members of a particular community are traitors or not authentic Indians, because you might disagree that a particular subsidy that has gone to them is unfair, right? Okay. And more I've come to feel, I mean, when I'm teaching constitutional law, we'll go through all of these. But often in our politics, these questions turn out to be not about justice. They actually turn out to be about excuses for venting a identity and a poison that in a sense you already subscribe to. And if you don't find one excuse, you find another, okay, we had Ayodhya as an excuse, now let's move on to something else.
Okay, so thank you, sir. There were a lot of other questions also, which unfortunately we won't be able to take because of the time constraints. So whomsoever could not get his or her question asked, I'm really sorry.
Can we just take one from Aman? He put his hand up first. Sorry, I didn't want to keep on. Maybe I can just speak to him offline.
Okay, so Aman, if you could unmute yourself.
Hello, am I audible, sir?
Yeah.
Thank you. First of all, thank you. That's very generous of you. And I had a long question, but because of the other questions, a few parts have been answered. So I'll just keep it very simple. So what social forces do you think have been responsible for the erosion of constitutional morality so that we have ended up at the place we are? And going in future, what social forces would you think are to restore this, the constitutional morality in the society, if it is to be restored at all?
Okay, so the short answer is, look, there's a saying in political science often that elites are the ones to destroy their societies, or at least they give the opening. And I think in the case of constitutional morality, it is actually India's elites who've abdicated. I mean, there's no other explanation for why the Supreme Court is doing what it's doing. I mean, this is, we can go into kind of mass politics and all of that stuff, right? At some point, and this I say with, I think, sort of both sadness and conviction at the same time. Particularly as India's growth story began to sour post 2009. I mean, this is of course a long process. It's going on from the 1920s, but just to simplify the story a bit. When India's elites were no longer confident, right? That in a sense they were keeping up their part of the social contract and the social bargain, right? Part of their vicarious satisfaction is to rake up nationalism, and nationalism is often any kind of elite project in this particular incarnation, right? It's also a very clever political project because it allows 80% of people to feel that they're at least superior to somebody else, right? It has that kind of psychological dimension to it. It did tap into some real problems, I mean, which previous regimes had kept untapped. But it is the kind of upper class and particularly Indian capital. So if you think of the control of the information order, right, this daily spewing of hate on Indian television would not be possible without the active cooperation of Indian capital, which has gone over to Hindutva lock, stock and barrel, right? With some middle class support. So the crisis of institutions largely came from this class. Why the people followed and voted particular parties, that's a more complicated story. This is also the class that got lazy, right? I mean, one of the things you have to say about the Congress party, that its sense of bizarre entitlement, right, which only comes from its elite character, right, meant that they weren't doing the kind of hard work of mass mobilization and outreach that the BJP was doing. I mean, whatever else you may say about the BJP, you may not like it, but as a grassroots organization and political machine, it's absolutely fantastic, right? That absence of outreach on our part, right, meant that the field was completely free. So that's where probably the repair will have to begin.
Okay, thank you, sir. And this, I think, brings us to the end of the session. And sir, I'd like to thank you for gracing the inaugural event of Literati. Thanks a lot for your precious time. I'm pretty sure everyone who attended this event gained something out of it. And I mean, if this would have been possible, it would have been great to host you at IIT Delhi if physical seminars would have been a reality. So we look forward to hosting you again in the subsequent editions of Literati. And sir, thanks a lot for your valuable time.
Thank you so much. Thank you. And good luck to all of you.
Thank you, sir. Thanks a lot.